The first time I knew my family would choose to let me go was on a sun drenched Saturday. I was 10, clutching an inhaler while my brother, Thomas, filmed my heaving chest. Drama queen. He'd laugh, his voice a soundtrack to the terror in my lungs. My parents watched, nodding along, convincing themselves this was just another one of my episodes. That memory has always been a ghost in my life, a chilling reminder of where I stood. But that ghost became a flesh and blood monster when a frantic text from my daughter, Lily, shattered the quiet of my office. "Mom," it read, "I can't breathe." My phone rang, and it wasn't from Lily, but from my mother, and her voice, calm and steady, was filled with the same cold indifference. "She's just being dramatic, honey," she said before I dive into my story. "I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here." Clara's professional life was a study in structure and logic, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that had always defined her family on that Tuesday. My office, with its scent of aged paper and stale coffee, felt like a sanctuary, a carefully constructed fortress against the unpredictability of the world. The afternoon light, filtered through the horizontal blinds, cast long parallel lines across my polished oak desk, illuminating a stack of legal journals and a framed photograph of Lily. The words on the trust agreement I was reviewing were a familiar, comforting rhythm, a language of clauses and provisions that I had mastered over 2 decades. It was a language of control, of predictability, a safe harbor from the stormy seas of my personal history. It was in this quiet, predictable world that my phone vibrated with a text from Lily, my daughter. It wasn't the usual cheerful emoji or a photo from her sightseeing trip. This was a raw, visceral plea for help. "Mom," it read, "I can't breathe." My stomach seized. A wave of cold dread washed over me, a feeling so primal it momentarily eclipsed all the years of legal training. It was the same feeling that had once choked me, a feeling of being trapped and powerless, a ghost from my own past that had suddenly materialized in the present. A second later, my mother's face, serene and perfectly made up even through the pixelated screen, appeared on a FaceTime call. My hands, which had been so steady and sure just moments before, trembled slightly as I answered. "Clara, darling, there you are," she said, her voice smooth as silk, a sound that had always soothed and betrayed me in equal measure. Her smile was a practiced mask, a performance she had perfected over decades. "I'm calling because Lily's being quite a handful, just like you used to be. Thomas says she's just having a little anxiety attack. Nothing to worry about." My mother's words were a cold blade, twisting a wound that had never truly healed. She spoke of her own grandchild's suffering with a detached, clinical air, as if Lily were an experiment she was observing from a safe distance. The casual cruelty in her voice was a ghost from my past, a sound I had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. It was the sound of a dismissive wave of the hand, a sigh of exasperation, a cold, empty silence where empathy should have been. I could see them behind her, the whole family, my father, with his booming laugh that had always seemed to be at my expense, sat by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a pillar of patriarchal indifference. My brother, Thomas, the golden child and self-proclaimed medical genius, was animatedly telling a story, his face flushed with the kind of smug confidence that had been his defining trait since childhood. My cousins laughed along, their faces a blur of complicit merriment. The scene was picturesque, a perfect family portrait, a lie. But in a quiet corner of the frame, I saw a crumpled form on an antique settee, her small hand clutching a pillow. It was Lily, and no one was paying her any attention. They were a family of actors, and their performance was seamless. They had left her alone in a room full of people who were supposed to love her, to laugh at the very thing that was suffocating her. I could almost hear the echo of Thomas's cruel laughter from my own childhood, a sound that had been branded into my memory. Don't worry about a thing, my mother concluded, her voice a final, unceremonious punctuation mark. We're just heading out for dinner. She can rest until we get back. And just like that, she ended the call, leaving me alone with the silent, echoing threat of my own past. The air in my office suddenly felt thin. The quiet hum of my computer fan was replaced by the frantic pounding of my own heart. The carefully constructed world of logic and order I had built for myself was collapsing, brick by brick. I knew I couldn't drive. My hands, which had been so steady and sure just moments before, were now shaking so violently I couldn't even grip the steering wheel. The thought of getting behind the wheel of a car, of navigating the complex web of traffic and speed, was an impossibility. I grabbed my bag, my fingers fumbling with the strap, and called a cab, my mind a storm of memories and fears. The journey to the airport was a blur of rain-slicked streets and blurred city lights, the world outside the taxi window an impressionistic painting of my own disquiet. Each passing car felt like a taunt, each streetlight a silent, judgmental observer. The driver, a kind old man with a worried frown, kept glancing at me in his rearview mirror, his silent concern a sharp contrast to the casual cruelty of my family. My mind raced back, not to the legal precedents I had been reviewing, but to a different kind of precedent, a pattern of emotional neglect and gaslighting that had defined my entire life. I was the overly sensitive one, the dramatic one, the one who exaggerated everything. My brother, Thomas, was the golden child, the self-proclaimed genius, the one whose every word was gospel. I remembered a dinner party when I was a teenager. I had been struggling with a severe anxiety attack, a feeling of being trapped in my own body, unable to breathe. I had tried to explain it to my parents, but they had simply exchanged a look of weary impatience. "She's just being dramatic," Thomas had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She just wants attention." The words were a brand, a label they had burned into my soul. I had spent a lifetime trying to prove them wrong, trying to be the calm, rational, logical woman they had always accused me of not being. I had built a fortress of legal documents, of logic and reason, to protect myself from the emotional chaos of my family. But now, that fortress was crumbling. The raw, primal plea of my daughter had torn through all my defenses. The airport terminal, a place I hadn't set foot in for 20 years, was a sensory assault. The sterile and metallic scent of jet fuel, a smell that had always triggered my phobia, clung to the air like a shroud. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my palms grew slick with sweat. I could feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the cold dread of a panic attack threatening to consume me. But this time, my fear was different. It wasn't paralyzing as it was a fuel, a roaring engine of maternal rage that burned away all the terror and anxiety. The old fears were still there, but they were no longer the master. They were the kindling for a new, all-consuming fire. I thought back to the last time I'd been on a plane. I was a child, maybe 12, and an unexpected bout of turbulence had sent me into a full-blown panic. I had sobbed, clutching the armrest, while Thomas, ever the prankster, had filmed my terror with a handheld camcorder. He later added sound effects of crashing planes and played the video at a Thanksgiving dinner, to the uproarious laughter of my family. "You really need to grow out of this," my mother had said, her voice devoid of empathy. "It's embarrassing." My phobia wasn't just a fear of crashing. It was a fear of being laughed at, of being shamed for my vulnerability. It was a fear of my family's casual cruelty. But as I sprinted towards my gate, that fear was gone. The only thing I could see was Lily's small, crumpled form in the background of that video call. The only thing I could hear was my mother's dismissive tone. I was no longer the little girl they had bullied. I was a mother, and I was coming for my daughter. The flight was a blur of contained terror and furious resolve. I sat in my seat, my knuckles white as I gripped the armrests, my eyes closed against the sight of the world rushing by outside the window. Every slight shudder of the plane, every announcement from the pilot, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I replayed the video call in my mind, a horrifying tableau of my family's casual cruelty. My father, with his booming laugh, was a man who had always valued appearances over genuine connection. My mother, with her serene, perfectly made-up face, was an expert at emotional detachment. And Thomas, the self-proclaimed medical genius, was the master of gaslighting, of twisting reality to suit his own narrative. They had left Lily, my small, fragile daughter, alone in a room full of people who were supposed to love her, to laugh at the very thing that was suffocating her. The image of her crumpled form on the settee, her hand clutching a pillow, was a brand on my soul, a fire that burned away all my fear and replaced it with a cold, hard resolve. When I landed, the air was thick with the scent of rain and exhaust fumes. I hailed a cab, my voice shaking with an urgency that was not my own. "Hospital, the emergency room, now." The driver, a young man with a tired face, didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and peeled away from the curb, his car a blur of speed and purpose. The journey was a whirlwind of blurred city lights and the rhythmic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I had always been a woman of logic, of reason, of carefully constructed plans. But now, I was a woman of instinct, a mother driven by a primal need to protect her child. I found Lily in a quiet corner of the emergency room, looking even smaller and more fragile than she had on the video call. An oxygen mask covered most of her face, and her small hand, cold and clammy, was clutched around the blanket. The sight of her was a dagger to my heart. My own throat tightened with a fresh wave of panic, not for myself, but for her, a nurse, her face etched with a weary kindness. Told me that Lily had had a severe allergic reaction to something in the meal she'd been served. If she hadn't been brought in when she was, the nurse said, her voice dropping to a low, serious whisper, it could have been much worse. A few more hours, and we'd be having a very different conversation. My rage, which had been a simmering controlled heat, finally erupted. It was a silent, internal scream. I was a criminal investigator for a reason. I had built a career on evidence, on logic, on a truth that didn't require permission to exist. I knew what it felt like to be disbelieved, to have my reality twisted and distorted. Thomas, however, still believed his word was gospel. He stormed in moments later, his face a mask of self-righteous indignation. "What in God's name is going on here?" "Clara," he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "I told you it was just anxiety." He was a doctor, but not an allergist, not a respirologist, not even an emergency room physician. He was a general practitioner, but he wore his title like a king wears a crown. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice as calm as his had been on the phone. "The doctor here says she had an anaphylactic reaction." "Thomas, not an anxiety attack." His face reddened. "That's absurd." He scoffed, turning to Lily with a condescending air. "She's always been so sensitive, just like you. I'm sure it was just a mild flare-up. You're blowing this out of proportion." Clara, the words overly sensitive, drama queen, exaggerating, were like a broken record, a pattern of emotional abuse that had defined my entire life. I had spent my childhood trying to prove them wrong. I wasn't going to let Lily do the same. The confrontation with my parents was not in a hospital, but in the sterile, impersonal lobby of their hotel. They sat on a plush velvet couch, looking as though I had interrupted a very important meeting. My father, with a glass of whiskey in his hand, looked at me with an expression of weary disappointment. "We trusted Thomas's judgment." "Clara," he said, his voice firm. "He's a doctor. We didn't want to overreact." "You've always been one to overreact." My mother nodded in silent agreement, her gaze drifting away from mine, as though she were a passive observer in her own life. I tried to reason with them, to make them understand the gravity of what they had done. "You left a child in a room alone, knowing she was having a medical emergency, because her cousin was excited about a sightseeing tour?" I said, my voice shaking with the effort to stay calm. You listened to Thomas, who has no business giving medical advice on this matter, and you made a child feel like her pain was an inconvenience to your vacation. That is not just neglect, it is cruelty. My father's eyes narrowed. The cost of this trip alone. Clara, he said, his voice growing cold. You're ruining a perfectly good vacation. You're always so dramatic. That was the last straw. The word dramatic, a weapon they had wielded against me my entire life, finally lost its power. I looked at them, at the two people who had once been my world, and I saw only strangers. I saw the empty echoes of my own childhood, a horrifying, living tableau of everything I had sworn to protect my daughter from. In that moment, I realized that they hadn't just neglected Lily. They had attempted to erase her, just as they had attempted to erase me. I stood up, looked them straight in the eye, and without another word, I walked away. The flight back was silent. My rage had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to scream at them, wasn't going to plead with them, wasn't going to seek an apology. I was a lawyer, and I was going to use my training, my knowledge, my power to do what my family had never done. I was going to hold them accountable. I walked back into my office, the scent of stale coffee now a welcome comfort, and began my work. I was not a woman driven by emotion, but a woman driven by logic, by a need for justice. My legal specialty was in trusts and estates, and I had helped my parents establish a single, complex family trust years ago. It was an ironclad document, designed to protect their assets from all manner of legal challenges. It was, I now realized, the perfect weapon. I spent the next few days in a fog of legal research, poring over stacks of documents, my fingers tracing the fine print of legal statutes. I wasn't looking for a vague loophole. I was looking for a chink in the armor, a crack in the foundation that would allow me to bring the whole thing down. I found it in an obscure legal precedent regarding fiduciary duty. The law stated that a trustee of a family trust had a legal obligation to act in the best interests of all beneficiaries. I argued, with quiet precision, that my parents and Thomas had not only failed to act in Lily's best interests, but had actively neglected her, a child who was a direct beneficiary of the trust. It was an audacious legal maneuver, one that had rarely been used, but I had a case and I was going to use it. I drafted a single, concise email, a final, cold missive that was as clean and professional as a legal brief. It stated, without a shred of emotion, that due to their willful neglect and endangerment of Lily, I was formally severing all ties. I was resigning as a trustee, and I was preparing to file a legal challenge to their management of the trust. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the quiet precision of a surgeon's scalpel. My mother's reply, instantaneous and predictable, was nothing short of a textbook example of gaslighting. Clara, the email read, "You are destroying this family. This is what you do. You always have." It was her last, desperate attempt to make me feel small and irrational. But this time it didn't work. The words bounced off me like a rubber ball, leaving no impression. The old me, the little girl who had been so desperate for her parents' approval, would have crumbled. But the new me, the one who had flown through her fear to save her daughter, was made of a different kind of steel. The legal battle that followed was not a loud, dramatic affair. It was a slow, methodical process of discovery, depositions, and filings. The most satisfying part, for me, was not the courtroom drama, but the quiet, relentless chipping away at their foundation. I had filed for a temporary injunction, citing the family's gross negligence as a breach of their fiduciary duty to all beneficiaries of the trust. A hearing was set, and Thomas was forced to testify. He sat on the stand, his face a mask of self-importance, his voice filled with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his word was law. But my lawyer, a brilliant, tenacious woman named Sarah, was relentless. She asked him about his advice, about the medical facts, about the psychological validity of his diagnosis. Thomas, so used to being unquestioned, faltered. He was forced to admit that his counsel was not based on a medical examination, but on his own personal bias. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible moment, but to me, it was a thunderclap. The golden child's crown had finally fallen. The financial repercussions were immediate and devastating. The family's assets were frozen pending the outcome of the lawsuit. The life they had so carefully built on a foundation of privilege and entitlement began to crumble. The phone calls started, first from a distant aunt, then from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Clara," they would say, their voices filled with a false sense of concern. "Your mother is a mess. Can't you just move on?" They weren't calling because they cared. They were calling because their own lives, their own privileges, were being threatened. The final call came from my father. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. He was desperate. "Clara!" he pleaded, his voice a pathetic shadow of the man who had once laughed at my childhood fear. "We can't pay for the summer house. We need you to drop this." He wasn't apologizing. He was bargaining. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had won. The settlement was brutal. My family lost a significant portion of their assets. And the judge, citing Thomas's cavalier attitude and my parents' willful ignorance, made the case a matter of public record. Thomas's license was suspended, his career as a doctor in ruins. They were forced to sell their home and downsize, their once picturesque life now a faded, yellowed photograph. They tried to apologize. Of course, they came to my home. Their faces a mixture of desperation and resentment. "We're so sorry, Clara," my mother said, her voice a thin, reedy imitation of her former self. "We never meant to hurt Lily." I looked at them, at the two people who had once laughed at my pain, and at the brother who had filmed it for sport. I felt nothing. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, with a gentle smile on my face, I turned and walked away. Years have passed. Lily is now a strong, confident young woman, her health stable and her spirit unbroken. The memory of what happened is a quiet line in the sand, a boundary no one will ever cross again. I received a letter from Thomas not long ago. He had moved to a small town, a world away from the city he had once conquered, and was working in a tiny clinic, trying to rebuild his life. His apology was heartfelt, full of a genuine remorse I had never thought him capable of. He confessed that he had never been able to forget the look on my face on the flight back home. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he wrote. "I was wrong about you then, and I was wrong about Lily." I read the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because my peace wasn't contingent on his forgiveness. It was a peace I had built for myself, with my own hands, in the quiet aftermath of a war no one else knew I was fighting. The victory was not loud. It didn't come with the clash of cymbals or a triumphant shout. It came in the quiet, steady hum of my office computer, in the rustle of legal papers, in the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for her existence. The legal battle had been a masterclass in quiet, relentless warfare I had hired Sarah, not just for her legal acumen, but for her unwavering professionalism and her ability to cut through emotional theatrics. She understood that this was not a family dispute. It was a matter of professional and legal accountability. The temporary injunction I had filed had been a surgical strike, freezing the family's assets and forcing them to confront the very real, very painful consequences of their actions. The depositions had been particularly satisfying. Thomas, so used to being the smartest man in the room, was utterly out of his depth. Sarah, with her calm, steady voice, had dismantled his defense piece by piece. She asked him to define anxiety attack in a medical context, then compared his informal diagnosis to Lily's official hospital records. She forced him to admit that he had never once examined Lily, that his medical advice was based solely on his personal bias and his desire to dismiss her suffering. The smug confidence on his face had slowly drained away, replaced by a pale, hollow look of disbelief. The man who had once filmed my panic for sport was now the subject of public humiliation, his career hanging by a thread. My parents, in their own deposition, had been even more pathetic. They had tried to paint me as the dramatic one, the one who was always overreacting. But the cold, hard facts of the case, the hospital report, the doctor's testimony, the video call that had been recorded on my phone were an unassailable wall of evidence. My mother, so used to controlling the narrative, had faltered, her perfectly made-up face cracking under the pressure. She had admitted, in a shaky voice, that she had prioritized a dinner reservation over her own grandchild's health. The confession was not one of remorse, but of grudging acknowledgement, a hollow admission that the game was over. The phone calls from my extended family had been a pathetic chorus of thinly veiled self-interest. My aunt, a woman who had always seen me as the black sheep, had called, her voice dripping with false concern. "Clara, your mother is a mess," she had said. "She's losing everything. Can't you just let this go?" She wasn't worried about my mother's emotional state. She was worried about her own access to the family's financial resources, which were now frozen. My cousin, a man who had laughed at Thomas's video all those years ago, had called with a similar plea. "This is tearing the family apart. Clara, don't you see what you're doing?" He saw the family's financial security, their carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement, crumbling before his eyes. He didn't see the little girl on the settee. The final call came from my father. He wasn't angry anymore. He was desperate. "Clara," he pleaded, his voice a pathetic shadow of the man who had once laughed at my childhood fear. "We can't pay for the summer house. We need you to drop this." He wasn't apologizing. He was bargaining. He was treating my daughter's health, my own emotional well-being, as a pawn in a real estate transaction. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had won. It wasn't a win in the traditional sense, with a trophy or a certificate. It was a win of the spirit, a victory of the truth over a lifetime of lies. The settlement was brutal. My family lost a significant portion of their assets, and the judge, citing Thomas's cavalier attitude and my parents' willful ignorance, made the case a matter of public record. Thomas's license was suspended, his career as a doctor in ruins. They were forced to sell their home and downsize, their once picturesque life now a faded, yellowed photograph. They tried to apologize. Of course, they came to my home, their face a mixture of desperation and resentment. "We're so sorry, Clara," my mother said, her voice a thin, reedy imitation of her former self. "We never meant to hurt Lily." She didn't look at me. She looked at the expensive Persian rug on my floor, at the artwork on my walls. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry for what she had lost. I looked at them, at the two people who had once laughed at my pain, and at the brother who had filmed it for sport. I felt nothing. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, empty space where a family should have been. I simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, with a gentle smile on my face, I turned and walked away. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their forgiveness. I had my own. I had forgiven myself for being the dramatic one, for being the one who overreacted, for being the one who had finally, after all these years, stood up for herself and her daughter. Years have passed. Lily is now a strong, confident young woman, her health stable and her spirit unbroken. The memory of what happened is a quiet line in the sand, a boundary no one will ever cross again. The panic attacks are gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that she is loved, that she is seen, that her pain is real and valid. I received a letter from Thomas not long ago. He had moved to a small town, a world away from the city he had once conquered, and we was working in a tiny clinic, trying to rebuild his life. His apology was heartfelt, full of a genuine remorse I had never thought him capable of. He confessed that he had never been able to forget the look on my face on the flight back home. The look of a mother, a warrior, a woman who is no longer afraid. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he wrote. "I was wrong about you then, and I was wrong about Lily." I read the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because my peace wasn't contingent on his forgiveness. It was a peace I had built for myself, with my own hands, in the quiet aftermath of a war no one else knew I was fighting.